Die realiteit van klimaatsverandering is soms bietjie nader in die vel as wat 'n mens sou wou erken, of waarmee mens gemaklik is. Nou, ons praat vanmôre met Dr. Chris van Straten, 'n ou bekende gesig hier by die groot ontbyt van International SOS, en ons praat spesifiek oor die effek van klimaatsverandering op oordraagbare siektes, veral in Afrika, maar ook op besighede en hoe besigheidseienaars voorberei al dan nie vir verwagte veranderinge. Good morning, Doc.
Good morning. Thanks so much for inviting me back on the show.
It's always lucky to have you. Let's start with climate change and the fact that, I mean, when I heard it at first, I thought, my goodness, that climate change and extreme weather caused by climate change, actually more extreme weather, is now causing a more contagious disease infection in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with these big weather changes, so it's a big storm or a big drought, that always gets the attention, right? And it's in front of you. So you can see it. Hier is die ding en dit is gevaarlik.
Yeah.
But after the big events, so let's look at Malawi with those massive tropical storms they had. Initially, there was the big flooding, damage to infrastructure. And then we saw this cholera just spiking up, infectious disease, because it took a long time to re-establish the clean water, the sanitation, and people being able to access clean water. Now with malaria, dis interessant. Ek gaan so 'n bietjie mengelmoes. Maar malaria het altyd, as ons nou kuier gekuier het, dit in die wintermaande as 'n kind, ons het nooit ons malaria pilletjies gevat.
No prophylaxis. Nee,
want
jy gaan nie.
die winter was koud, dit was droog, die gras was kort.
Is nie meer dieselfde nie.
Nou, ons was nou hierdie verlede Junie maand in die kuier en dit was nat en dit was groen en dit was net muskiete. En daai muskiete is die Anopheles muskiet en sy dra falciparum malaria. En sy maak vir jou dood. So ek het nou baie omtrent 5 pasiënte die afgelope jaar van daai omgewing behandel met malaria.
Wow.
En dis vir my nogal ding. So,
En is buite seisoonaal. Dis nie die aanvaarde
that's it. So altyd, and I'm going to go back to my English medical speak, but always in the Kruger Park, we advised in winter you don't need to take prophylaxis because you're probably not going to get bitten. Now I am making sure that I and my colleagues, I'm going to Angola in a couple of weeks' time, again for business and to support businesses, and we're taking our malaria prophylaxis. I've got my DEET impregnated clothing, socks. Only thing it isn't is my underpants. Everything else is DEET impregnated. I've got an impregnated mosquito net. And when I'm in Angola or Mozambique, I always make sure I'm in a closed room, closed door, air conditioning to make sure I don't get bitten. So you want to prevent getting bitten, and I'm taking my malaria prophylaxis. And if I begin with a fever or a temperature, I'm immediately going to get myself tested
First thing.
for malaria. Yeah.
Wow.
And here's another thing. It gets a bit scary, but this is important. It's like driving a car, right? You don't get into a car and the tires are shot and your brakes don't work and your seatbelt vacuuming. I'm not getting into that car.
Yeah.
I only get into a car if I know it's in good condition, it's been serviced, I've got enough fuel to get to where I need to be and back, and there's a backup plan. There's an emergency backup plan and a contact number. And of course, we've got a tracker on our car to make sure we know where it is. So when I'm going to malaria areas, I always double check what's the season, are there resistance patterns, what can I take to protect myself, and keep in mind, we saw 2 very sad cases in the last year. The one was a kid who'd been on holiday in Angola, gets sick, picks up malaria, but people don't think of it initially. They think maybe it's just a bit of a pharyngitis of a koue ding. And that kid sadly passed away from that. The other person that passed away was a well-known businessman who'd also been traveling in Angola and parts of Africa, went back to Paris. And in Paris, the doctors don't often see malaria.
So they didn't diagnose
They
it.
didn't think about it. And that patient passed away from malaria. So always, if you're traveling in any parts of Africa, please double check where you're going, what are the risk patterns, what are you going to do to prevent that, and should it happen, what is your backup plan? 'n boer maak 'n plan en jy moet altyd 'n backup hê.
Yeah, and I suppose with you describing the disease map changing and the seasonal changes, so we have to become more aware. There's not just a certain season or certain area that we can pick up these diseases. It has now, unfortunately, spread because of weather conditions. And you mentioned the second person was a business traveller, and I suppose also then getting back to the workplace and business and diseases. How do businesses go about protecting their employees? Because that's quite a prominent thing. We often see business people travel throughout, but we always think, okay, it's a quick fly in and out. But do we make enough actually plans to make sure we protect our people?
No, it's a great question, and it's a really important question. International SOS and Ipsos. Ipsos is a big research company based in Europe, in France. They do surveys every year of the Fortune 500 companies and the decision makers in those companies. And all of them have said climate change is definitely impacting us. 76% responded. It's impacting our abilities to operate. But only 50% said they've actually made concrete plans to adapt.
Sure.
So then I'm looking at that, I'm going, Now, by the way, my day job, we've got several hundred sites in Africa. So it's Angola, Mozambique, DRC, Kenya, Uganda. I'm overseeing several hundred healthcare providers, clinicians. And every single day I am reviewing or assisting with a case of a traveller who's either gotten sick with malaria or been in a car crash in Kenya or lost his medications while travelling. And now he's in the middle of the DRC. And what we as a company have specialised doing the last 30 years is going, okay, who's your approved backup support in Kenya? Or which clinic can you go to if you fracture your arm? Who can stabilise you, do your x-ray, and if we need to medevac you to Johannesburg, doing all those operational pieces, including air clearance. So businesses, especially the big Fortune 500, I think they realised this many years ago. You've got to think ahead, and you've got to plan. And you need a team, either embedded in your HR team or your ops team, that looks at which destinations are you going to, what are the security risks.
The dangers you'll be facing.
Because the elections that are coming up, I did a couple of webinars covering Ethiopia, not just from the election point of view, but from also the point of view of what are the infectious diseases, how has that changed. And if you were to get sick in Ethiopia during the elections, and if the airport is impacted, will we be able to medevac you out of that? So those are all the kind of operational and medical components that come into that. And that's what we do. So to businesses, you either need to make sure that you've got a plan to think of all those components or partner with somebody who specializes in doing that.
Our time is basically finished, but just a question out of left field. I'm worried about, I know now, climate change is causing temperature changes and moisture changes and rainfall changes. That changes seasons, malaria, cholera, and so forth. I'm thinking, well, what about the groot goggas, like geelkoors? Are these maps also going to shift slightly?
Yes, they are going to shift. Let me give you a good example. Dengue was, we see it in Africa.
Yeah.
And in, for example, malaria was eradicated. Malaria was in Europe a century back.
Yeah.
But due to drainage, fumigation, and all these different things we've spoken about, it was eradicated. I don't know if you know this, but dengue, malaria pitched up in parts of America last year. But internal cases in America, it's always been imported cases. You know, they went to the DRC and then they came back with malaria. There were 3 or 4. There was a Vivex case and falciparum cases down south in America. Internal transmission.
Wow.
And in Spain and in Paris, dengue pitched up.
My goodness.
Which means, and again, their winters were very short, very warm, less snow. So the mosquitoes are now getting traction in those parts of the world. So yes, we're going to see, and this is what nerds like me like doing, right? So our NICD, remember the previous discussions we had about cholera?
Yeah.
And I was anxious, you were anxious. Are we now going to see cholera in the tap water? And my answer was probably not. And a big part of why it hasn't happened is the NICD.
Yeah.
They're doing a sterling job at the borders, in our hospitals, tracking, monitoring. So the same with diseases like dengue and yellow fever. There is a genuine, not only a genuine risk, but it's already happened. But now we've got to track and monitor. How is that shifting?
How is that shifting?
Malaria is shifting, by the way, 50 kilometers north and south every year away from the poles. That's what it's doing.
Genade. Ek is op 'n senuwees. Baie dankie Dr. Chris van Straten. En elke keer as hy hier is, dan wil ek myself toesluit.
Yeah.
Iewers.
Just make a plan. Be prepared.
Be prepared. Nou ja, thank you very much Dr. Chris van Straten van International SOS. Wys jou, klimaatsverandering het 'n effek op siektes, oordraagbare siektes en wees voorberei. Nou ja, nie nodig om bang te wees soos ek nie.